Well, hello and welcome to potentially what will be a controversial blog today. One of the things that I've been teaching my courses is the whole notion of risk appetite and risk tolerance. Now, those terms are used interchangeably, and unfortunately, this is creating quite a lot of confusion within the risk management fraternity. And it's not helped by the fact that there are no examples within the ISO 31000 standard that potentially can identify the differences between those. And then on top of that, people are coming from organisations to my training courses and saying, well, their bosses don't want to use the word appetite because it kind of indicates that they're hungry for risk. And so they call it risk acceptance level. Essentially, what I'm seeing is that all of these different terminologies are creating a confusion and clouding the true reality around setting the risk context for your organisation. What we need to do is to set our parameters within which we are going to manage risk. What you choose to call it is up to you. But there are a number of fundamental questions that you need to ask. The first and most important question is, what level of risk or what level of residual risk am I willing to accept as an organisation in the pursuit of my objectives? Now, what level of risk against certain categories? Now, those categories might be different. So you might have a very, very low acceptability for safety risks, and I think you should, and reputation. But you might be slightly higher on performance or financial management. So identifying your risk categories and then identifying what level of risk you are willing to accept, which actually becomes your target level of risk. So when you identify a risk, and analyse it, if it's sitting above that target, then straight away you know that you've got to take steps to try and reduce it down to that target. The second question that we need to ask is, what categories or what impact areas or what critical success factors am I going to measure my consequence against? And if we remember from some of the other blogs we've talked about, asking that question with strategic planning, what does success look like? And out of that drops our critical success factors for our consequence matrix. We then look at it and say against each of those, this is question 3, we look at each of those categories and we say, what does a severe consequence look like to us as an organisation against each of those categories? And this is going to express once again your, I guess, not so much appetite, but what is your threshold for pain is what I call it. Now, to use an example, those of you who know, I served 20 years in the Army. Now, when we are training in Australia, we have a different threshold for pain in terms of safety-related incidents than we might have on operations in a war zone. Now, we still try to stop deaths and injuries, of course we do, but of course the situation in Australia is a lot more benign than it is over in a war zone, and so we have a lot less control. So our consequence matrix might be slightly different for in-country as opposed to outside. The next question we need to ask is, well, what does almost certain look like for us? Is it more than once a year? Is it 100 in 1,000? Is it, once in 3 months? What does almost certain look like for us? We really do need to ask that question as well, because if we get this wrong, or if we have an inappropriate likelihood matrix, then we are also going to see some real problems with our risk assessments. And finally, the question we need to ask is, what sort of matrix are we going to use? Are we going to use a 3x3 matrix, or my preferred one, a 5x5 matrix? But more importantly, what does each square represent? So if it's almost certain and it's a severe consequence, then that should probably be an extreme risk. So in the top right and the bottom left, that's, pretty clear cut. You've got extreme risks in the top right, you've got low risks in the bottom left, if that's how your matrix is oriented. But what about those ones in the middle? And here's the thing. The way that you structure that matrix is going to demonstrate how conservative you are as an organisation. And if you choose the wrong type of matrix, or you've got the squares the wrong colour, i.e. you're a very, very highly conservative organisation, but you've got a lot of boxes that are at the medium and the low level, and not so much at the high and the extreme level, your matrix is not actually reflective of the nature of the business that you're doing. And so you really need to make sure that you just ask all of those questions. And that is going to set your risk context. Too many people and too many organisations are scrambling around, what's my risk appetite? What's my risk tolerance? It's even legislated or regulated in certain areas, like in the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, APRA, asking for risk appetite statements, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. So there's this void there of knowledge around appetite and tolerance that people are filling with their own opinions. To me, there's a fundamental outcome that you want, and that is to actually set your risk context. And if you ask those 5 questions that I talked about, then you will actually be able to do that. So let's just go over those. What is the level of risk that I'm willing to accept against all of my particular categories? What am I going to measure my consequences against? What are my critical success factors? What does severe look like against every one of those critical success factors? What does almost certain look like from a likelihood perspective? And finally, what does my matrix look like? What size is it? And what are each of those squares going to represent? If you can do that, you can nail your context, and the rest of it will flow on from that. That's all I've got for this session. As always, let's be careful out there.